The tension in the courtroom was unmistakable. Every eye was fixed on the imposing figure of the judge, who sat high above the rest, his face carved with frustration. He had warned Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett once before for what he called disruptive behavior. But now, his patience had clearly run out. His voice boomed through the chamber as he pointed directly at her. "That's enough, Ms. Crockett. You're held in contempt of court," he barked, slamming his gavel with a sharp crack that echoed off the marble walls. Jasmine stood firm, her expression steady but clearly surprised at the sudden outburst. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't interrupted, but she had dared to challenge a line of questioning that she knew was flawed, and apparently, that had struck a nerve. The gallery stirred as whispers began spreading among the spectators. Phones were lowered, eyebrows were raised, journalists scribbled faster, some leaned forward, anticipating the drama that was surely about to unfold. Jasmine slowly turned to face the judge directly, raising her eyebrows slightly. Her stance was composed, dignified. "Your Honor, I respectfully," she began, but the judge cut her off with another bang of his gavel. "Enough. You've shown repeated disregard for this court's rules, and you will pay a $5,000 fine effective immediately." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Jasmine blinked once but showed no other reaction. The courtroom went still. Her team glanced at each other, unsure whether to object or stay quiet. For a moment, it looked as though the Congresswoman might back down. After all, being fined by a federal judge wasn't just rare, it was politically damaging, not to mention insulting for someone with her credentials. But instead of reacting with anger, she took a breath and stepped forward with measured grace. Her silence lasted just long enough to command the room's attention. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He expected protest. Instead, Jasmine placed her palm flat on the desk before her and calmly requested to speak. The judge narrowed his eyes, granting her 1 minute to make a final statement before moving on with the hearing. And that's when something began to change. The room could feel it. The energy wasn't defiant, it was deliberate. Something was coming, and everyone could sense that this courtroom drama had just begun to flip its script. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her posture calm but resolute. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, tabbed binder, each section meticulously marked with colored flags and handwritten notes. The room watched in absolute silence, stunned by her composure after being slapped with a fine. Without raising her voice, she opened the binder to a section labeled, "Procedural Violations," and began to speak with measured clarity. "Your Honor," she began, locking eyes with the judge, "I'd like to reference Rule 3.03 of the Code of Judicial Conduct, as well as the ruling in Brady v. Maryland that directly addresses what just occurred here today." The judge's eyes narrowed, his lips tightening. It was clear he wasn't expecting her to push back, not like this. She turned a few pages, found the citation, and read it aloud, articulating every word with deliberate precision. In Brady, the court determined that the suppression of evidence favorable to an accused violates due process, and the principles behind that ruling apply here, when this court chose to ignore context before issuing a contempt order. The room was still. The silence had shifted from tense to electric. Even the clerks paused their typing to watch. The judge leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, as if trying to determine whether she was bluffing or truly building a legal foundation beneath her feet. Jasmine didn't flinch. She turned to another page, this time referencing a more obscure case, one the judge clearly hadn't anticipated. Furthermore, in United States v. Young, the appellate court found that courtroom authority does not shield a judge from error, particularly when discipline is issued without proper justification or hearing. That precedent is binding in this circuit. There it was. A ripple ran through the crowd. Reporters who'd come expecting a routine hearing now realized they were watching something else entirely, a chess match where Jasmine had just moved her queen into position. The judge sat back, his jaw clenched, clearly caught off guard. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, but said nothing. Jasmine saw the hesitation and pressed forward. "I don't raise these cases to undermine this court's authority, Your Honor. I raise them because it is the duty of every officer of the law to hold our institutions accountable, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then." Her tone was firm, respectful, but unyielding. She wasn't asking for the fine to be removed. She was demanding the court acknowledge the legal standard that had been violated. A murmur ran through the gallery. Jasmine had not only defended herself, she had turned the courtroom into her stage and transformed the accusation into an opportunity to educate. Her legal argument was airtight, but it was more than that, it was a message. She wasn't there to challenge authority for drama's sake. She was there to show what it meant to stand up with both courage and knowledge. And at that moment, the balance of power in the courtroom began to shift, not by force, but by facts. The judge sat still for a few moments, his eyes frozen on the open binder in front of Jasmine Crockett. It was clear from his expression that her citations had struck a nerve. He had expected a flustered defense or emotional plea. Instead, he got surgical precision wrapped in courtroom decorum. His hand, once firm on the gavel, now hovered with hesitation. Slowly, he leaned forward, squinting at the page number she had just cited, then turned to his own clerk, whispering something under his breath. The clerk immediately began typing on the court computer, no doubt pulling up the case law Jasmine had so confidently referenced. A faint wave of murmurs passed through the gallery. Everyone could feel it. Something had changed. The courtroom wasn't just listening to Jasmine anymore, they were learning from her. The judge cleared his throat, but this time his tone was different. "Ms. Crockett, you said United States v. Young, Ninth Circuit," he asked, his voice no longer commanding but cautiously inquisitive. Jasmine nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. Ninth Circuit, 1985. The court ruled that judicial discipline without proper due process is itself a reversible error." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward his own notes. The transformation in his demeanor was subtle but undeniable. His rigid posture softened, his gaze no longer dismissive. He was no longer reacting to a disruption, he was now reacting to someone he had underestimated. The silence in the room stretched, not with tension, but with awe. He tapped his pen on the bench, visibly processing what had just occurred. "Approach the bench, Ms. Crockett," he said at last. It wasn't a demand, it was a request, one that carried an undertone of recognition. Jasmine walked forward, her steps steady, unhurried. As she arrived before him, the judge looked her in the eye, and for the first time, his voice lowered to something almost private. "You know the law better than most attorneys have seen in this room," he admitted. Jasmine said nothing, letting the silence hold. It was not arrogance, it was assurance. She had done what needed to be done, without flinching or boasting. The judge turned to his clerk again and nodded. "Strike the contempt charge from the record," he said quietly. Gasps echoed in the room, faint but audible. He turned back to Jasmine. "This court was hasty, and your citations were compelling." That last word hung in the air like a rare confession. He wasn't just acknowledging the legal foundation, he was admitting fault, something rarely seen from the bench. Jasmine gave a courteous nod and took a step back. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, but her eyes spoke volumes. The moment wasn't just a legal win, it was a seismic shift in how she would be viewed from that day forward. The judge, still seated, glanced down at the fine he had earlier scribbled onto his docket. He scratched through it with one stroke of his pen. The courtroom was silent, respectful. No one dared interrupt what had just unfolded, a demonstration of knowledge so profound that it turned authority into admiration. As Jasmine stepped back from the bench, the air in the courtroom buzzed with silent energy. Her calm rebuttal, delivered with surgical precision, had left a deep impression on everyone present. For a brief moment, the room was suspended in disbelief. Then, it happened, softly at first. A slow clap began from the back of the gallery. One spectator, overcome by the grace and intellect Jasmine had just demonstrated, couldn't help but express admiration. It was hesitant, unsure if the formality of the courtroom allowed such a gesture. But others quickly followed. Applause rippled through the crowd like a rising tide, cautious but building. Within seconds, the room erupted into a standing ovation, a rare, spontaneous moment of acknowledgement within such rigid walls. Even opposing counsel, who had previously sat with crossed arms in quiet judgment, now sat forward in his chair, visibly impressed. He wasn't smiling, but there was a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had underestimated her too. The clerk, usually robotic in movement, paused her typing and looked up, eyes wide with admiration. Even the bailiff, typically a stern and immovable presence, raised an eyebrow and allowed himself the faintest smirk. Jasmine, standing alone in the center of the courtroom, did not raise her hands in victory or bask in the attention. She remained still, absorbing the moment with silent dignity. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not with pride, but with gratitude. She had not come to be applauded, she had come to be heard. The judge tried to bring the room back to order, tapping his gavel lightly, not with the stern command from earlier, but with a softened gesture, more ceremonial than forceful. "Order, please," he said, almost sheepishly. The applause slowly faded, but the energy did not dissipate. It lingered in the room, woven into every corner, every stare, every shift in posture. Everyone had witnessed something extraordinary, not a spectacle, but a revelation. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman defending herself. She had just out-argued a federal judge with nothing but her mind, her voice, and her preparation. Reporters were already typing furiously, some whispering to each other, their eyes gleaming with the knowledge that this moment would dominate headlines. Legal genius silences courtroom, one would write. Judge humbled in real time, another might pitch. And through it all, Jasmine remained the still point in the storm of attention. No grandstanding, no gloating, just clarity and conviction. The judge looked down at her, his face less stern now, almost curious. Ms. Crockett, I believe we're all reminded today of what real advocacy looks like, he said softly. The gallery, though quiet again, hung on every word. Jasmine inclined her head politely. Justice isn't about power, Your Honor. It's about truth, she said gently. Her words hung in the air like a final note of a perfectly played symphony. There was nothing left to add. The moment, simple and profound, belonged to her. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly changed from the stern figure who had earlier imposed a fine without hesitation. His eyes followed Jasmine as she returned to her seat, his expression no longer rigid but thoughtful, as though he were still mentally retracing her argument. He tapped his pen on the wooden bench once, then set it down with deliberate care. After a long pause, he cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom in a tone far gentler than before. Let the record reflect, he began, that the earlier fine levied against Ms. Crockett is officially rescinded. A soft gasp swept across the room, followed by silence once more. Furthermore, he continued, glancing briefly at Jasmine before returning to his notes, the court acknowledges the exceptional legal argument presented today. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly, eyes forward. She wasn't surprised, she was prepared. She knew what she had just done, but she didn't need the validation to know her worth. Still, the words carried weight. The judge leaned forward slightly, looking directly at her again. Ms. Crockett, your presentation demonstrated clarity, control, and command of the law rarely seen in this courtroom. You've reminded this court, and perhaps myself, of the depth and dignity the legal profession demands. There was a pause, a space where no one moved. It wasn't just a concession, it was an acknowledgement. A judge, publicly and officially, recognizing that she had outmaneuvered him not with pride, but with precision. Jasmine gave a subtle nod in return. No smile, no need for words. The moment was louder than any applause. The court proceedings moved on, but the energy never returned to what it was. Every glance toward Jasmine now carried a different weight, a deeper respect. Even the opposing attorney, clearly recalibrating his approach, adjusted his papers with a newfound sense of caution. The gallery members whispered among themselves, their earlier doubts transformed into admiration. Some even leaned to catch a better glimpse of the woman who had just rewritten the courtroom's rhythm. As the session concluded, Jasmine gathered her materials with practiced efficiency. People rose from their seats, and some hesitated as she passed, as if unsure whether to speak or simply let her walk by, untouched by compliments. One young intern near the gallery edge managed to say, "That was incredible." Jasmine paused just briefly, offered a small nod, and moved on. She didn't need the spotlight, she was the spotlight. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to prepare their segments. Cameras focused, microphones were adjusted. But Jasmine didn't stop for interviews. She walked calmly to the waiting car, the wind gently catching her coat as she opened the door. Behind her, the courthouse remained, unchanged in brick and stone, but forever marked by what had unfolded within. Inside the vehicle, her aide asked, "Do you want to make a statement?" Jasmine shook her head with a soft smile. The court already heard everything it needed. And with that, the car pulled away. The woman they tried to silence had not only spoken, she had taught them all what power truly looks like when it's rooted in knowledge, principle, and grace.